Volume as an overall variable is the key, but intensity is the delineating factor as to whether or not that volume is even effective in the first place. Is there such a thing as an unavoidable limitation from a structural standpoint? Finally, what supplements do I take or should you take for strength? Now, okay everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Q&A. Obviously, took a little bit of a break last week, went through the auto-regulation side of things. After that was requested by quite a few people. If you haven't watched that video already, I would strongly recommend you go and watch it. There's quite a lot of practical tips that you'd be able to implement straight away. But we're going to return back to the routine of the Q&A. Got 3 questions this time round, okay? Again, as is the case, they're the more influential of the ones that were sent across and will hopefully allow me to give a decent overview so that you can actually develop, the understanding around the topic rather than it just being definitive answer, okay? So the first one is high volume or high intensity training for maximum muscle growth. Okay, so this is by Seb. So again, this is quite a general question of the concept of building muscle overall, okay? But there's quite a few points that we can take away directly, and one main one that's something I've been wanting to speak about for a while actually. First thing is, if you look into the empirical world and this evidence-based fitness with all these really influential YouTubers and dissecting what the research shows, volume is the key driver, okay? So systemic volume, which what I mean by that is 3 sets of 10 and 10 sets of 3 produce a similar overall tonnage, okay, which is something I'll mention in a moment. They produce a similar hypertrophic result within the populations that are tested in that study. Now, again, in that scenario, the benefit of research in general is to try and apply it to the masses. But from an anecdotal standpoint, we can't necessarily ignore what has worked for people beforehand. And we know that people have been able to build muscle from one top set to failure. Dorian Yates springs to mind. There's a lot of top level bodybuilders, and although we know genetics are a huge, if not the largest variable in that scenario, what I'm trying to say is we know that it's not as simple as there just being more reps and sets. And going back to what we spoke about a moment ago with tonnage, this is the key kind of argument in terms of seeing that intensity is a delineating variable. Tonnage is sets times reps times load, and it's a commonly used method of assessing volume. If tonnage was the only thing that mattered, okay, 10 sets of 10, like I mentioned a moment ago with 3 sets 10 versus 10 sets 3, 10 sets of 10 with a 40 kilogram dumbbell, okay, let's say it's a German volume training in dumbbell press, would produce a similar hypertrophic response with 10 sets of 100 at a 4 kilo dumbbell. And we know, we don't need the research to show this, we know that that is not the case, okay? And this is one key thing to take away, that we know there's a minimum intensity threshold. Now, like I've mentioned in the auto-regulation video, we tend to say that within the strength world is about 60% of your 1 rep max is the cutoff point where it's sub-maximal, but it's going to start to influence recovery and overload. But this is the key within bodybuilding, okay, that I want everyone to take away from today's video. Even if you stop the video within the next 2 minutes, take away this key point, okay? Intensity within the strength world is usually defined as absolute load or relative load over a certain predetermined range of motion. It can be calculated through a percentage of 1 rep max, but load is the key driver, okay? In bodybuilding, it's not. What is the key mechanism within bodybuilding is the stress that's placed on the muscle, not on the movement, okay? Now, everyone goes, well, yeah, obviously, but then they still opt for the exercise selection that allows them to leverage more weight. And if you look at a lot of the superficial programming kind of recommendations through different articles all over the web and everything like that, and I'm not saying that these are wrong, what I'm trying to get you to do is develop a deeper understanding of it. A lot of them will recommend that there's nothing better for building muscle than squats, deadlifts, bench press, that type of stuff. If that was the case, okay, all powerlifters would be the most muscular people on the planet, and they're not. If that was the case, when certain powerlifters are looking at developing muscle mass, they just stick to the main lifts. They don't. They move on to assistance exercises like dumbbell presses, shoulder presses, all these other exercises. And what I'm saying is, this whole compound versus isolation argument that a lot of people have is the wrong argument to be having. What we should be focusing on is which movement allows you to leverage the most amount of weight through that individual muscle, okay? And this isn't to say that you should slow everything down, go to a 5-pound dumbbell and just focus on mind-muscle connection. There is a time and a place for driving output to a certain muscle, but we also need to step back a little bit, have a bit of a think, okay, in terms of, am I getting the most out of that particular movement for that muscle? And this is again where a lot of people get confused. They see squats as, I know what, I can lift the most weight on a squat, which means that must be the best exercise for my quads, when in reality the technique is absolute dog shit and they're not loading their quads at all, so they would be better suited to use another movement entirely to overload their quads. People usually, okay, would leverage a barbell movement because they don't have to think, and it's kind of an automatic response for the muscle to kick in. But that's not the goal for bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is to overload an individual muscle. So let's take the example of a close grip bench press versus something like a tricep press down. Most people would turn around and say, I know close grip bench press is a compound movement, I can lift more weight, I can get a higher intensity, that's going to build my triceps more. But what if you don't know how to recruit your triceps effectively in that movement? What if you have a shoulder impingement issue that is limiting the range that you can go to? Or, like it's a scenario, one of like my training partners, for example, what if you have such big delts that your delts take over everything and you can't place the overload onto your triceps? In that scenario, the tricep press down is the most ideal movement for building those triceps. So again, just take a little bit more of a deeper look into what am I actually getting out of the movement. Because although I absolutely love the kind of cohesive approach of all these different disciplines of strength, and I love them all being merged together, and this is actually a video I'm going to do in the future about the different disciplines of strength, creating disparity between what tools you're going to use and how you use them is probably the biggest bit of advice I could give, okay? Understand that if you're looking to build muscle, build muscle. If you're looking to build strength, build strength. Treat them as two separate entities within the same session, okay? So you don't have to, say, right, well, one day I'm only going to lift heavy over a really short range of motion. What I'm saying is don't pick a shitty tool, okay, for a job that you're trying to do. It's just common sense, guys, but when it comes to training, people forget about it, okay? If I'm looking at putting a nail into the wall, I'm not going to use a spanner. That just doesn't make any sense. I'm going to use a fucking hammer, okay? If I'm looking at building conditioning, I'm not going to use a barbell. It just doesn't make sense. This is the problem that the CrossFit community has had. It works, but it's nowhere near as effective as a Concept 2 rower. On the flip side, if you're looking to get strong, you don't use battle ropes. It just makes sense when you think about it this way. But again, within the bodybuilding world, people get confused. So the key takeaway from this is rep quality is a key principle within bodybuilding when we talk about the mind-muscle connection and being able to actually overload the muscle. And that's what we are meaning when we're talking about intensity. We're not talking about weight on the bar. We're not talking about weight on a dumbbell press. We're talking about, can you overload the individual muscle and build the muscle on its own? Volume is the key driver. So over the course of time, rather than thinking about, I need to get that 40 kilogram dumbbell press up to a 50 kilogram dumbbell press, you should be thinking I need to be getting my 38 to 44 kilo dumbbell press and increase the volume within that range. That would be a better recommendation in my opinion anyway. Key thing, like I said, to take away is it's intensity that's placed on the muscle, not absolute weight, okay? And if you really want the kind of proof in the pudding with this, go and watch someone like James Hollinghead. He actually put up, when I recorded this video, he actually put a video up of his deadlift. He very rarely deadlifts. He just is a bodybuilder and gets incredibly strong with his hamstrings, glutes, back, everything like that. And then I swear he just went and deadlifted like 700 pounds for the first time. It's the first time he's deadlifted in however long, and he can still pick it up. That's the key takeaway for that one. Again, slightly general. If you want it specific to your case, just send me a message again and we'll talk about it, okay? So next question is, it's quite a specific one, this one actually. So is there unavoidable limitations on someone's strength from the structure that person presents with? So this person, Jordan, he was actually talking, he used the example of like Brian Shaw versus Novikov within the strongman world. They're built very differently. Does it mean that one person is going to, have a limit on their potential to build strength within a certain movement compared to someone who is more suited to that exercise, okay? Now, obviously, the answer within this one is it depends, which is the answer for most things. But again, the takeaway that you can get from this question is understanding the difference between what I like to call anatomical variance versus anatomical constants, okay? They're just big words, don't be put off. All it means is a constant is something that is unalterable. It's just there. It's just something that you've got to deal with. Your height, for example. Everyone calls me a hobbit. I ain't changing that. Unfortunately, trust me, I've tried. I've looked at the research. I've tried to make myself taller. It ain't gonna happen, okay? Femur length is another one. Overall, like arm length, for example, or wingspan is another one where you're not going to change it, okay? But anatomical variants are things that people often get confused to be something that would be a constant. So an example of this might be degree of hip rotation. Within the corrective exercise community, a while ago, I say a while ago, the past few years and everything, and you'd have a partner that would grab your foot, push the knee up to the chest, then they'd move it out to the side and they'd push it up, and then they'd find how your femur articulates within the hip socket, and then that's the way that you should squat, okay? Now, again, from a passive range of motion standpoint, yes, that is a very good test. But when it comes to the actual execution of a movement, I'm yet to meet anyone who doesn't have some kind of mobility restriction that they either A, weren't even aware about, or B, that actually directly influences how they execute a movement. It might be mobility from a neurological standpoint, so skill acquisition in general. They don't know how to create torque at the hip to stabilize the joint, so that limits the depth. You know, they sit at their desk all the time, the hip flexors are tight as shit, so you know they can't actually achieve a certain level of stability within the pelvis. Ankles are tight as hell. The point being, there's a lot of different variables that go into what would be perceived as someone's structure, that a lot of the time these things are malleable, you can change them. Another one's rib cage size and position, okay? Again, we won't go into that too much because that can get quite geeky, but that's going to have a direct effect on things like bench press strength, you know. So that's the first thing that I wanted to cover with that is it can be broken down into two separate areas, okay? You have certain constants that are obviously unalterable, and then there is actually this element of being able to change things like postural mechanics and whatnot that would give the perceived change in structure. In this scenario, okay, we need to then ask the question of how much influence do you have? And it is specific to certain movements, you know. The squat is going to be more heavily influenced by femur length than something like the deadlift. But the point being is there's still world record squatters that have really long femurs. There's still world record deadlifters that have really long femurs. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily limit you. It just makes it harder, okay? A really simple example would be to watch someone like Ed Coan deadlift versus someone like Brad Gillingham, who was an IPF lifter a while ago in the super heavyweight class. A lot of people kind of forgot about him for a while, but he's like the master of the hook grip. He hook gripped before hook gripping was cool. And the guy's legs are like longer than my entire body, which I know isn't difficult, but the point being is that wasn't a limitation for him. In fact, he actually leveraged it. Andy Bolton was another one. He had a really high hip position when he started the deadlift because he had quite long femurs. So his deadlift execution was more weighted towards hamstrings and lower back rather than quads and glutes. So all that's to say, it's not necessarily a limitation on your potential. It's just going to change the strategy through which you execute something, okay? They're not necessarily limitations. It's more going to alter the way that you have to approach that movement and the technique that you're going to employ. And that's going to tie in with what I said at the start about the anatomical constants versus variance, okay? If you're someone that has fairly long femurs, there's two approaches that you could take within the squat. You could try and improve your hip rotation to be able to use a slightly wider stance, which would effectively position, if you think about it from a biomechanical standpoint, it would position you through more of like the frontal plane rather than the sagittal plane, so your torso angle would be able to stay more upright. So in that scenario, you could actually look at changing this anatomical variant of the hip rotation steadily over time, which would give you a technique that would essentially negate this, quote, limit on structure. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, just drop a comment below, because I know it's a lot of big words and whatnot. But then, like I said, you see people that just lean into it and they say, you know what, fuck it, I got long femurs, it means I'm going to fold myself in half when I squat, I'm just going to get a strong as shit lower back and I'm going to just stand the weight back up again. It's not right or wrong, and it's not necessarily a limitation so much as it's just the way you approach that movement from a technical standpoint. And unfortunately, what you will tend to see is it will require more time and effort being spent on that movement, okay? And this is where we start to talk about training psychology in general. Do you spend the majority of your training time becoming, quote, well-rounded, trying to fix these weak points? Or do you just lean into it and say, you know what, this is the position I'm strongest in, let's just get strong there, okay? There's no right or wrong necessarily, it's just understanding that, like I said, these are limitations in structure. They're not necessarily limitations, they're just things you have to consider that are going to directly influence your technical execution and your training prescription overall. So I know that's a little bit of a general answer, but I hope that makes sense with that one. I don't necessarily think that, like me personally, I don't think limitations in structure are really a thing, okay? I think there's too many examples at the elite level and just at the local level, to be honest with you. There's too many examples of people that don't necessarily fit the mold. They don't necessarily fit the mold of the perfect built lifter that are still strong as hell. Do you know what I mean? I think it's just one very small variable. Okay, and then finally, what supplements do I take or should you take for strength? Now, so the main ones that I take, creatine, caffeine, vitamin C, beta-alanine, acetyl L-carnitine more recently, okay? So I'm going to go through each of them in turn. If people are interested in like in-depth videos on each supplement, then I'm more than happy to do them. But to be honest with you, there's that many supplements to choose from that we could be here all day. So these are just the ones that I have and that I've seen direct improvements within. Okay, so creatine, I take creatine monohydrate. There's a saying that I heard a while ago at a strength conditioning seminar, which is there's two types of people that take creatine and then people that should be taking creatine. At the end of the day, the list of benefits are just endless. It's probably the most researched supplement out there. For those of you that aren't aware, what it does is it basically increases the recycling of ATP into the ATP PC energy system, so the power energy system, essentially, to keep it really simple. Okay, with that, again, there isn't a loading phase, guys. I can't believe they're still actually putting that on the supplement recommendations, that you have to cycle it on and off. No, you don't. You just take it, keep taking it. Once you're saturated, just stay at that level. It's absolutely fine. From a supplementation standpoint versus like natural diet, you do tend to find creatine in like red meat. Eggs is another good source, but usually the amount that you would be able to eat of those foods relative to other health markers doesn't actually allow you to, quote, saturate those levels. So creatine monohydrate is very valuable. You'll notice that directly when it comes to power output. 1 or 2 extra reps at a certain weight, an extra couple of kilos on the bar. It's not a linear thing, guys. So if I take 5 grams and I get 1%, doesn't mean if I take 10 grams I'm going to get 2%. That's not how it is, but you will notice a benefit straight away out of them. Caffeine, I don't really need to say anything else on this. The only thing I would recommend people understand with caffeine is the half-life relative to your sleep cycle. If you're that guy that's slamming pre-workout in at 8 o'clock at night, good for you, but it's probably not actually going to net you a larger benefit than the loss in sleep quality that you will have. Some people are actually quite desensitized to caffeine, so they I don't know whether it's from a biochemical standpoint that their half-life is faster. I don't think that's how it works necessarily, but they don't feel it and it doesn't affect their sleep quality quite as much. But for the vast majority of people here, the 2 o'clock cutoff point is a very good recommendation for the average like coffee. This isn't even pre-workout, this is just a cup of coffee, where if you have it past 2 o'clock, it won't necessarily reduce, where it won't influence your sleep, if that makes sense. So again, just use common sense with that one, guys. If you're going in for an evening session at 8 o'clock at night because you want to get stronger and you want to take some pre or double scoop or whatever it is that the cool thing is nowadays, and it's increasing this fight or flight like sympathetic stimulation, and then you're trying to go to sleep and you're missing out on an hour's worth of valuable recovery, it's circular logic, because you're going to take more scoops to try and get stronger, and then you're going to hit this crash point, and it just doesn't really make sense. So yeah, caffeine is obviously a very, very valuable stimulant, but I would recommend trying to have it pre 2 o'clock if that is feasible, or just bear in mind that it's going to have some kind of influence on your sleep. Vitamin C intake, okay, now this one is actually largely anecdotal on my end, I must admit, but vitamin C, I take effervescent tablets in the evening. They're very good for, like, they come vitamin C and zinc, they usually come in that effervescent form. Very good for immune support anyway. If I'm feeling even a little bit ropey, I'll pop 2 or 3 of them. It says on the RDA side of things that it's like 3000%, which is again why I'm not recommending that you take these, but I've always noticed, whether it is placebo or not, don't really care, that it immediately makes me feel better. But the one thing I have noticed with vitamin C intake is in ischemic conditions, it tends to help the recovery. So what I mean by that is, or hypoxic conditions. So basically when I've done a high lactic acid or high oxidative stress training session, so higher rep work, sprints, conditioning, that type of stuff, I'm quite sensitive to that from like a fascial tightness, if that's even a thing, where my whole body kind of feels a little bit stiff. Vitamin C probably has the largest influence on that for me in terms of recovery, so that's something that you could have a play around with, but again, I'm not recommending it. Beta-alanine, okay, one thing, so beta-alanine is a lactate buffer. Again, this has a larger influence on like the lactic acid energy systems, so your moderate to higher rep ranges, or the conditioning work that you might be doing, so supersets, that type of thing. It has got a lot of research behind it to show that it is very valuable, and anecdotally you will feel it. However, there is one big side effect with this that a lot of people get really freaked out by when it's nothing to worry about, but it's not necessarily pleasant, which is you'll get this tingling feeling, okay, in your fingers and in your feet, and it can actually spread throughout your whole body. It's kind of like having pins and needles, but throughout your whole body anytime something touches your skin, and it's a really, really weird sensation. Some people like it, some people hate it. You can actually get this from a lot of pre-workouts as well, because they've started putting beta-alanine in quite commonly. So that's just something to bear in mind. Really simple way to nullify that is to have a decent amount of carbohydrates when you take in beta-alanine, okay? You still might feel it, but it does nullify the effects, and I've seen that with like high-level athletes in particular. There is some research to show it, but within high-level athletes, I've actually physically seen it change where they don't get any of those side effects either. So again, it definitely works. I only really take that when I'm going through a more of a quote metabolic block, if that's what you want to call it, where my rep ranges and volume is higher, but I don't take it all the time. And then finally, one I've started taking more recently is acetyl L-carnitine. So within like this biochemistry book that I've been reading, it transports the acetyl groups out of the mitochondria directly, and then that can be used to resynthesize acetylcholine, which is obviously a key neurotransmitter. So all of that is to say, it has been shown to have a little bit of a favorable effect on strength and anything that requires a high surge from the nervous system, if that's the right word. But it also helps glucose metabolism under ischemic conditions again. So when that lactic acid is starting to kick in, so there is some research to suggest it can help with the lactic acid buffer, very similar to what beta-alanine does as well. So guys, nice quick one there. I say quick, still 20 minutes long, but you know, quick with the questions. Hope you took something away from today's video. Just to summarize with each of them, high intensity versus high volume, it's not a case of versus, it's a case of them being two sides of the same coin. Volume as an overall variable is the key, but intensity is the delineating factor as to whether or not that volume is even effective in the first place. Intensity should be derived as the stress that is placed on an individual muscle, rather than the weight that is on the bar. The second question, is there such a thing as an unavoidable limitation from a structural standpoint? In that scenario, you have to distinguish between anatomical constants versus variance. Is it something you can have an influencing factor on? The limitations in structure that you might have will directly influence your technical execution and the amount of time and effort and training prescription you have to give to that exercise, but it won't necessarily present a limitation because there's just too many variable body types and body shapes when it comes to the top end of the strength game to even pinpoint it down to one perfect build. Finally, the supplements that I take: creatine, caffeine, beta-alanine, vitamin C, L-carnitine, and whey protein and casein. Okay guys, hope you took something away from today's video. Please leave a comment below if you liked it or just like the video. It does definitely help, and I'll look forward to your next wave of questions next week. Okay, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.